one touch. That was all it took for the dare to stop being a game. It was just enough time for Karen S. Jones to press her lips against the stranger's mouth, taste the sharp iron of blood and the smoke of expensive cigars, and realize she hadn't just kissed a man. She had just claimed a dragon who was already looking for a reason to burn everything down. The base of the iron cell didn't just fade, it died. The club held its breath, the air turning heavy and static, as if a storm had just rolled into the VIP booth. Karen pulled back, her loose curls brushing against her leather jacket, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She expected a grin, a wink, or the usual drunken amusement of a man who'd just been kissed by a beautiful woman. Instead, she found stillness. Han Do-yun didn't move. He didn't blink. He just sat there, a mountain of silent, broad-shouldered muscle that seemed to swallow the neon light. His eyes locked onto hers with the terrifying focus of a predator that had been disturbed, dark and unreadable, and absolutely dominant. He wasn't built like the men she knew. He was built like a weapon, thick-necked, powerful, and dangerously calm. The black ink of a dragon's tail curled up his throat, disappearing into a clean fade that spoke of military discipline. His hand rested on the table, massive and still, but it was his knuckles that made her stomach drop. They were split and raw, stained with a deep, glistening crimson that was still wet. It wasn't a bar fight's mess. It was the calculated work of a man who made his living in the pits. In that silence, Karen realized the copper taste on her lips wasn't hers. It was his last opponent's. "You have no idea whose shadow you just stepped into," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration that felt like a physical weight on her chest. The bass in the iron cell was a physical blow, a rhythmic thumping that Karen usually found liberating. Tonight it felt like a countdown. She stood in the center of the neon haze, her black leather jacket slick under the flickering lights, her natural curls bouncing as she took the final step toward the corner booth. Her friend's laughter was a distant, muffled echo, drowned out by the sheer gravity of the man sitting alone. He was a silhouette of absolute control. Han Do-yun didn't look like the other clubgoers. He sat with a terrifying, upright stillness, his broad shoulders filling the booth as if the air itself was afraid to crowd him. Karen leaned down, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, and pressed her lips to his. It was like kissing a statue made of warm granite. He didn't flinch. He didn't respond with the eager heat of a stranger. Instead, Karen felt the sharp, sudden sting of ozone and the heavy scent of expensive tobacco. As she pulled back, her breath hitched. The club didn't just go quiet. The atmosphere curdled. The laughter of her friends died mid-throat, replaced by the sudden, heavy movement of 3 men in dark suits who appeared from the shadows like sharks sensing blood. Karen's gaze dropped from his sharp, unreadable East Asian features to the table. His hand was resting there, massive, steady, and terrifyingly scarred. Fresh, dark blood glistened across his knuckles, staining the white linen napkin beneath his drink. It wasn't his blood. It was too thick, too bright, a trophy from a violence she couldn't imagine. The dare was for a kiss, right? She whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Do-yun finally moved. He tilted his head, the black ink of a dragon's tail creeping up his neck and disappearing behind his ear, highlighting the jagged line of his jaw. His eyes weren't filled with the drunken lust she had expected. They were cold, analytical, and absolutely certain. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a variable he had just decided to solve. A dare, he rumbled, the sound vibrating in his chest, low and dangerous. He didn't smile. He didn't look amused. He looked like a man who had just watched a rabbit walk into a snare. You have no idea what you just started, Karen Jones. The fact that he knew her name before she'd even introduced herself sent a cold spike of dread down her spine. The dragon of the underground didn't just accept kisses. He accepted tributes. As his hand reached out, not to strike, but to wrap firmly around her wrist with the weight of a handcuff, Karen realized the club wasn't a party anymore. It was a cage, and the door had just locked behind her. The grip on Karen's wrist wasn't tight enough to bruise, but it possessed the terrifying weight of an anchor. Do-hyun rose from the booth, his height forcing her to crane her neck back. He didn't lead her toward the neon-lit exit where her friends stood paralyzed. Instead, he maneuvered her toward a heavy steel door behind the bar, guarded by a man whose face was a map of old scars. As the door hissed shut, the muffled thump of the nightclub was replaced by something raw and rhythmic. The sound of flesh hitting sand and the low, guttural roar of a crowd that didn't want to be found. They descended a concrete staircase that smelled of copper, sweat, and damp earth. They emerged into a sub-level arena where a single cage stood under a harsh industrial spotlight. Do-hyun didn't stop until they reached the edge of the pit. He finally released her arm, but the sudden freedom felt like a trap of its own. He gestured toward a slumped figure in the corner of the cage, a young man with a split lip and eyes swollen shut, trembling as he clutched a stomach clearly purpled by heavy blows. "Marcus?" Karen's voice was a ragged whisper. Her brother didn't look up. He just let out a pained, wet cough. "He has a talent for losing things that aren't his," Do-hyun said, his voice as smooth and cold as the obsidian ring on his finger. He pulled a small leather-bound ledger from his inner pocket, flipping it open to a page marked with her family name. The numbers were written in precise, elegant calligraphy, but the total at the bottom was a death sentence. 400,000. He bet on a ghost, thinking he could outsmart the house. My house. Karen looked from the blood on the floor to the calm, unreadable face of the man beside her. He doesn't have that kind of money. We don't have that kind of money. I know, Do-hyun replied. He stepped closer, his broad frame blocking out the light of the arena, casting her in his shadow. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe in the flickering overhead light. Which is why I'm not asking for money. I need a face that people trust. A soft face to manage the legitimate side of my betting lines. Someone who looks like they belong in a boardroom, not a cage. Someone who won't be suspected when the numbers start to shift. He leaned down, his lips ghosting past her ear, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain returning to haunt her. Work for me. Use that Ivy League education to fix what your brother broke, and I'll let him walk. Refuse, and he becomes the next warm-up act for a man who doesn't know how to pull a punch. Karen looked at Marcus, then back at the dragon. The dare from the club felt like a lifetime ago. She realized then that the kiss hadn't been a mistake. It had been an audition, the transition from the blood-stained concrete of the underground to the glass and steel heights of the city was so jarring, it felt like a fever dream. The elevator rose in a silence so thick, Karen could hear the frantic drumming of her own pulse. When the door slid open, she didn't find a lair of debauchery or a den of thieves. She found a sanctuary of brutal, minimalist perfection. The penthouse was a cathedral of black marble and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the sprawling city lights, yet it felt colder than the fighting pits. There were no photos on the walls, no stray books on the tables, and no scent of life. It was a space designed for a man who expected to be alone. "This is your room," Do-Yun said, gesturing toward a door that stood slightly ajar. His voice was no longer the growl of the pit boss. It had returned to that terrifyingly calm, even tone. Karen walked to the window, her reflection, small, slim, and clutching her leather jacket like a shield, ghosting over the skyline. "How long?" she asked, her voice cracking. "How long do I have to be your ghostwriter before Marcus is actually free?" Do-Yun didn't answer immediately. He moved to a small, low table in the center of the living area, where a traditional tea set sat waiting. He moved with a precision that was hypnotic, his massive tattooed hands performing a ritual of grace that contradicted the violence she had seen them commit only an hour prior. "Until the debt is balanced," he said, pouring the water with a steady hand. "And until I am certain you won't run. Loyalty is a currency your brother lacks, Karen. I am curious to see if you possess it." She watched him from across the vast, empty room. In the harsh, fluorescent lights of the club, he had been a monster. Here, in the soft amber glow of the penthouse, he looked like a man trapped in a prison of his own making. He sat in the center of his empire, surrounded by millions of dollars in art and technology, yet there wasn't a soul in the world he trusted to sit across from him. The dragon wasn't just a title of power. It was a sentence of isolation. He lived in a world where every touch was a threat, and every word was a maneuver. As he looked up at her, his dark eyes catching the glint of the city lights, Karen felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that wasn't fear. It was the realization that in this golden cage, they were both captives. He was simply the one with the keys. "Sleep," he commanded, though the word lacked its usual bite. "Tomorrow, you begin the ledger. I don't keep people for their company, Karen. I keep them for their utility." He turned back to his tea, his broad back a wall of muscle and ink, once again settling into a stillness that felt more like a burial than a rest. Karen retreated to her room, realizing that the most dangerous thing about Han Do-Yun wasn't his fists. It was the quiet, hollow space he carried inside himself. The transition from the quiet isolation of the penthouse to the neon-slicked docks of the industrial district happened in a blur of black leather and cold adrenaline. Do-Yun didn't give Karen a weapon. He gave her a role. She was to be the diversion, the soft face that would keep the attention of a rival boss known as the Vulture, while Do-Yun's team reclaimed stolen inventory from a nearby warehouse. The meeting took place in a private, glass-walled office overlooking a shipyard. The Vulture was a man who smelled of cheap grease and expensive arrogance, surrounded by guards who looked like they enjoyed their work too much. Do-Yun stood behind Karen, a silent, looming presence that radiated a heat she could feel through the back of her jacket. "She's new," the Vulture sneered, his eyes raking over Karen's curls and the nervous tension in her shoulders. "The dragon is bringing pets to business meetings now? She is my consultant." Do-Yun's voice was a low, steady rumble. "And she has questions about the shipment you claimed was lost at sea." Karen felt the weight of Do-Yun's hand briefly touch the small of her back, a signal. She stepped forward, forcing her voice into a tone of polished, corporate confidence she hadn't used since her last internship. She didn't talk about blood or cages. She talked about logistics, maritime law, and the unfortunate legal consequences of holding cargo without a manifest. She leaned in, using the open, vulnerable features that had always made people trust her, spinning a web of technicalities that made the vulture's eyes glaze over with greed and irritation. For 20 minutes, she held the room. She watched the way the rival boss's eyes stayed on her, completely oblivious to the silent shadows moving across the shipyard below, or the faint, muffled sounds of a warehouse door being breached. Suddenly, a radio chirped on one of the guard's belts. The vulture's expression shifted from amusement to realization. But before he could stand, Do-yun was there. He didn't draw a gun. He simply leaned over the desk, his massive frame casting the room into a sudden, terrifying shadow. "The cargo is already in my trucks," Do-yun said softly, "and your men are currently deciding if they want to live through the night." As they walked back to the car, the night air biting at her skin, Karen's hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a sudden, jagged electricity. She had played the game. She had lied, manipulated, and won. She looked at Do-yun, who was watching her with a look that was almost like approval. "You liked it," he observed, his eyes catching the flash of a passing siren. Karen didn't look away. The rush was a warm, dangerous bloom in her chest, a feeling of power she'd never found in her safe life. "I hated him," she whispered, "and I liked making him look stupid." Do-yun opened the car door for her, his fingers brushing against hers. For the first time, the touch didn't feel like a contract. It felt like an invitation to a deeper darkness. The penthouse felt different tonight, smaller, charged with a static electricity that made the air hum. Do-yun sat on the edge of a low leather bench, his black shirt discarded on the floor. He had returned from a private correction match at the pits, and while he had won, the victory had left a jagged, bleeding furrow across the heavy muscle of his shoulder. Karen moved with quiet purpose, her natural curls pulled back, a first aid kit open beside her. Her hands trembled slightly as she dipped a cotton swab into antiseptic. This was the closest she had ever been to his bare skin. Without the armor of his fitted shirts, he was a map of old wars. His torso was a landscape of corded muscle and silver scars, nearly entirely consumed by the black ink of the dragon. As she pressed the swab to the wound, Do-yun didn't flinch. He sat with that same terrifying stillness, though his breathing was heavy, the scent of sweat and iron filling the space between them. "This one," Karen whispered, her fingers ghosting near a swirling pattern of scales that coiled around his ribs, separate from the main dragon. "It looks different. Older." Do-yun looked down at his own skin as if seeing it for the first time. "That was the beginning," he said, his voice a low, raspy vibration. "In the slums of Busan, you don't get a name, you get a mark. Every inch of this ink represents a debt paid, or a life taken to keep my brother, and then myself, alive." The dragon wasn't a choice, Karen. It was a cage I built to stop the world from breaking me. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the loneliness she had sensed before, etched permanently into his flesh. She moved to bandage the wound, her fingers brushing against the heat of his skin. The contact felt like a spark in a room full of gasoline. She realized she was no longer looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with a hunger that mirrored the dark intensity in his eyes. She reached up to secure the tape, and for a second, her chest brushed against his arm. The world stopped. Do-yun's hand, massive and scarred, suddenly shot out, wrapping around her waist and pulling her firmly between his knees. The first aid kit tumbled to the floor, forgotten. The power imbalance was staggering. He looked up at her, his sharp features illuminated by the dim amber lights of the city, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air in the penthouse wasn't just thin, it was gone. "You should stay away from the ink, Karen," he growled, his thumb tracing the hem of her leather jacket, dragging her closer until she could feel the frantic heat of his body. "Once the dragon marks you, there is no going back to the light." "Maybe I'm tired of the light," she whispered, her hands finding purchase on his broad, naked shoulders. The tension snapped. Do-yoon's hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her curls, pulling her down into a kiss that wasn't a dare or a claim. It was a collision of two predators, finally recognizing each other in the dark. The afterglow of the penthouse was a fragile thing, shattered 48 hours later by a cold whisper in a dark hallway. Karen was leaving the ledger room in the sub-basement of the club when a hand clamped over her mouth, pulling her into the shadow of a supply closet. It wasn't the heavy, familiar warmth of Do-yoon. It was Elder Park, a man with a face like crumpled parchment who had served as the ring's bookkeeper for decades. "The dragon is getting soft," Park hissed, his eyes darting toward the door. "He looks at you and forgets to look at his back. That makes him a liability to the syndicate." He pressed a small amber glass vial into Karen's palm. It was cold, the liquid inside clear and innocuous, looking like nothing more than water. "He drinks a pot of tea every night at midnight. 1 drop, and your brother's debt is erased. 2 drops, and you're back in your safe life, with enough untraceable cash to never look back. The white tigers are moving in, Karen. You don't want to be standing next to a dead god when the temple falls." Karen looked down at the vial, her fingers curling around the glass. The rebellion that had always defined her surged, but it was tangled now with a confusing, fierce protectiveness. For weeks, she had told herself she was a captive, a victim of her brother's stupidity and Do-yoon's cruelty. But as she stood in the dark, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a part of the machinery. She returned to the penthouse, the vial heavy in the pocket of her leather jacket. Do-yoon was at his usual table, his back to her, the steam from the teapot rising in a slow, elegant curl. He looked vulnerable in his discipline, a man who survived by routine and the assumption of his own invincibility. "The ledger is finished for the night," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was a drum in her ears. "You're late," Do-yoon remarked without turning. "The elder kept you." It wasn't a question. He knew everything that happened in his halls, yet he sat there with his neck exposed, trusting the woman who had every reason to hate him. Karen walked to the table and reached into her pocket. She looked at the teapot, then at the man who had shared his scars and his ink with her. She didn't open the vial. Instead, she set it down on the marble table with a sharp clack. Do-yoon's eyes tracked the glass, then moved slowly up to hers. The silence was absolute, a void that swallowed the city's noise. "Elder Park thinks you're soft," she whispered, leaning over the table until she was in his space, her curls shadowing her face. "He thinks I want my old life back." Do-yoon picked up the vial, turning it over in his massive fingers before crushing it in his fist. The glass shattered, drawing a single bead of blood from his palm, his own this time. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied. "And do you?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I think I'd find it boring," Karen replied, reaching out to wipe the blood from his hand with her thumb. The choice was made. She wasn't his captive anymore. She was his accomplice. The air in the sub-basement arena was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, cheap beer, and the electric ozone of a high-stakes night. It was the night of the quarterly finals, the kind of event where the betting lines were high enough to buy a city block. Karen sat in the elevated glass booth, her fingers flying across the tablet as she managed the fluctuating odds, her eyes constantly darting to Do-Yun. He stood by the cage, a pillar of black-clad stone, his presence the only thing keeping the volatile crowd in check. The shift happened in a heartbeat. It wasn't a shout, but a silence, a sudden synchronized movement of men in white tracksuits cutting through the periphery of the crowd. The White Tigers. A flashbang grenade detonated near the entrance, white light bleaching the world. Before the spots cleared from Karen's eyes, the sound of gunfire tore through the rhythmic chanting of the spectators. The glass of her booth shattered, raining diamonds over her leather jacket. She dove for the floor, her natural curls covered in dust, her heart roaring in her ears. Through the jagged remains of the window, she saw the chaos. Do-Yun was a whirlwind of violent precision, his massive fists breaking through the line of attackers. He was fighting toward the cage to protect Marcus, but he was being swarmed. A white tiger enforcer, a man twice the size of the others, was flanking him, a jagged combat knife glinting under the industrial strobes. Do-Yun was occupied with 3 men at his front. He couldn't see the blade coming for his ribs. Karen didn't think. The rebellious girl who took a dare was gone, replaced by something forged in the cold marble of the penthouse and the iron of the pits. Her hand hit the cold metal of a discarded handgun near a fallen guard. She had never held a weapon. It was heavier than she imagined, oily and smelling of burnt powder. She scrambled to the edge of the broken booth, her breath coming in sharp, jagged gasps. The enforcer was steps away from Do-Yun's exposed side. "Do-Yun!" she screamed, but the roar of the riot swallowed her voice. She leveled the gun, her slim frame shaking, her vision narrowing, until all she saw was the dragon tattoo on Do-Yun's neck and the man threatening it. She squeezed the trigger. The kickback slammed into her shoulder, a jarring shock of reality. The enforcer crumpled, the knife clattering harmlessly to the concrete. Do-Yun spun, his eyes finding hers through the smoke and the screaming crowd. In that split second of eye contact, the power imbalance shifted again. He didn't see a captive or a lucky charm. He saw a partner. He nodded once, a sharp, grim acknowledgement, before turning back to the fray with renewed, terrifying ferocity. Karen didn't drop the gun. She tucked it into the waistband of her jeans, her eyes scanning the room for the next threat. The soft face was dead. The underground war had begun, and she was no longer watching from the sidelines. The arena had been scrubbed of the riot's debris, but the smell of copper and spent gunpowder still clung to the concrete. This wasn't a mere match. It was an execution of debt. The White Tigers had demanded a final blood sanction, their champion against the dragon. If Do-Yun lost, the syndicate, the city, and Karen's life would be forfeited. Do-Yun stood in the center of the cage, his black shirt discarded. The dragon on his skin seemed to pulse under the rhythmic flickering of the overhead lights. Across from him stood a titan of a man, a Russian mercenary with dead eyes and fists like sledgehammers. Karen sat at the edge of the pit, a headset pressed to her ear, her laptop glowing with the real-time biometric and betting data she had spent weeks learning to manipulate. Through the earpiece, She could hear the heavy, steady thrum of Do-yun's breathing. He was waiting for her signal. "He's favoring the left," Karen whispered, her voice a calm, sharp contrast to the roar of the bloodthirsty crowd. "Every time he lunges, his right heel stays flat. He's got an old injury in the Achilles hun. He's overcompensating with his lead hook." The bell rang, a sharp, industrial clang. The Russian moved like an avalanche, his strikes heavy enough to shatter bone. Do-yun took the hits, his body absorbing punishment that would have killed a normal man. He was playing the long game, retreating, letting the giant exhaust his adrenaline. "Now," Karen hissed, her eyes locked on the screen. "He's breathing through his mouth. His heart rate is spiking. 3 seconds until his next lunge. Step inside the arc. Aim for the base of the throat." Do-yun moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. He didn't just strike, he flowed. As the Russian swung a massive, lumbering hook, Do-yun ducked, his body a blur of ink and muscle. He surged upward, his fist connecting with the exact pressure point Karen had identified in the fighter's history files. The sound was like a tree branch snapping. The giant froze, his eyes bulging as the air left his lungs. Do-yun didn't stop. He unleashed a barrage of strikes, precise, clinical, and devastating. Every blow was a syllable in a language Karen had helped him write. "Finish it," she whispered. Do-yun delivered a final spinning kick that sent the champion crashing into the chain-link fence. The cage rattled, the sound echoing like a funeral knell. The referee didn't even bother to count. The dragon stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving, his gaze snapping instantly to the edge of the pit where Karen stood. He didn't raise his arms in victory. He didn't acknowledge the cheering crowd. He simply looked at her, the blood on his knuckles glistening under the strobes. The debt was settled. The soft face had directed the monster's hand, and together they had decapitated an empire. The neon sign for the iron cell still hummed with the same electric buzz, but to Karen, the sound no longer felt like a warning. It sounded like a welcome. 6 months had passed since the night she had walked across this floor on a tequila-fueled dare, a girl in a leather jacket trying to prove she wasn't afraid of the dark. Now the dark belonged to her. She pushed through the heavy double doors, the bass vibrating through the soles of her designer heels. She still wore a leather jacket, but this one was custom-tailored, draped over a silk dress that cost more than her brother's original debt. Her natural curls were pinned back, revealing the sharp, confident line of her jaw. As she moved through the crowd, the sea of people didn't just part. It recoiled. They didn't see a soft face anymore. They saw the woman who had helped the dragon dismantle the white tigers from the inside out. She didn't head for the bar. She headed for the VIP booth, the same throne where Han Do-yun had sat in terrifying silence half a year ago. He was there, waiting for her. He looked exactly the same. Tall, broad, and powerfully built, but the atmosphere around him had shifted. He wasn't a solitary predator anymore. As Karen approached, he didn't stay seated. He rose to meet her, his massive frame casting a shadow that she stepped into with the ease of someone coming home. The dragon tattoo on his neck caught the red strobe light, appearing to move as he inclined his head toward her. "The collections from the northern docks?" he asked, his voice a low, intimate rumble that only she could hear over the music. "Settled," Karen replied, her voice steady and laced with a cold, professional satisfaction. She handed him a slim, black tablet, the modern evolution of the bloodstained ledger. They tried to skim 5%. I reminded them what happened to the vulture. They paid 6% for the inconvenience. Do-Yun's lips quirked. Not quite a smile, but a look of dark, shared pride. He reached out, his hand wrapping around hers. His knuckles were clean now, the scars a permanent map of their shared history. But his grip was just as dominant as it had been the night of the kiss. A group of girls stood near the bar, whispering and pointing toward their booth. One of them clutching a drink with shaking hands, clearly egging her friend on to approach the dangerous stranger. Karen caught the girl's eye and offered a slow, chillingly calm look of recognition. The girl froze, turned pale, and immediately looked away. Karen turned back to Do-Yun, leaning in until her lips were inches from his, mimicking the dare that had started it all. "Do you remember what you told me that night? That I had no idea what I was starting?" Do-Yun's eyes locked onto hers, focused and absolutely certain. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her lip. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice a growl of possessive heat. "I had no idea what we were starting." He sat back down, pulling her into the booth beside him. They sat together in the center of the chaos, two predators at rest, watching over a kingdom they had built out of blood, ink, and a single, reckless kiss. The dare was over. The rain had begun.